Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can get more information about the show. I've always been fascinated with language from a very early age. And language is used in a very particular way around issues of war and death and injury that comes as a result of war. The United States in particular seems to enjoy engaging in conflicts, in deadly conflicts, ones that cause death and harm to many people around the globe. But they don't particularly like hearing about what the specific consequences of those actions are in terms of death, in terms of injury, in terms of mutilation. And so it has constructed a language that has been adopted by many other places, many other countries around the world that protects us, protects our sensitivities around issues of death and injury. The one that comes to the top of my mind is collateral damage, which basically means that you killed some civilians. And I think that we have to be more open and more honest about words like that we hear in the media and we hear in news reports, because to such a great extent, they have just become a regular thing. They've formed the normal, everyday background to the way that we speak, and I think that's very disturbing. Fortunately for us, there has come about a webpage that you can go to, and an associated sort of book collection of terms called Words About War. And you can find that at wordsaboutwar.org. And Professor David Vine, who we have had on this show before, who is a professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., is one of the key writers of this. David Vine, welcome back to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Beowulf, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure, and so glad you're paying such close attention to language in ways that all too many people aren't.
It's kind of, I read 1984 as many high schoolers did, and Animal Farm, and looked at the ways in which very powerful regimes manipulate language to their own ends. And I had at one point a politically incorrect dictionary that had a section in it that was dedicated specifically to military terms. And I no longer have that, but I wish I did. But it seems like in a way, in a more practical and serious way, you have resurrected this. And I wonder, what was it that caused you to get to the point that you realized there was a need to compile all of these terms in one place?
There were a number of us, and I should really emphasize that this is a group project involving academics and activists, people who work in think tanks, some journalists, among many others, veterans among them, actually. And many of us were concerned about much as you have been, concerned about the way that war and foreign policy are talked about in the United States in particular, and around the world, but especially in the United States, the way in which so often war and matters of foreign policy are talked about in a kind of dehumanized way, in a way that doesn't call attention to the deadly human impacts of war. And this for a country, indeed, the United States, that has such a long track record of war, dating to independence, more than 135 countries, nations, and peoples that the United States has fought wars with, and virtually every.
It's a long list when you think about it. I mean, you talk about the number of words that we use to obfuscate war and death, and yet just the list of countries that we've been at war with is pretty big.
It is. Well, that provides something of the background of what motivated us to want to call upon people involved in any discussions of war and foreign policy. So we're talking, journalists, of course, but regular members of the public, as well as people who I think are often the source of much of this obfuscating language, this language that hides and disguises what's really going on. That is a group of elites in Congress and outside of Congress, and what's called the foreign policy blob, the group of elites that so often dominate foreign policy and decisions about going into war. We very much wanted to change the status quo when it comes to the language that is used, and encourage with folks who are in those elite communities, pressure them to use language again that is honest, that is transparent, that describes what is actually going on in the world, and especially when it comes to an activity that is war that has such deadly effects. Now, the current war in and on Gaza is sadly another example of where we have to pay very close attention to the kind of language that's being used and what it enables. Yeah. I think some of the most common language that one sees circulating in the US and European global press is language of Hamas's barbaric, so-called barbaric attacks, language of barbarism, of savagery. Israeli officials have talked about Hamas in terms of animals. And of course, this is the kind of dehumanizing language that George Orwell was pointing to and trying to change in his day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, is one form of death and destruction and dismemberment fundamentally any more or less barbaric than another?
Well, indeed. And while the Hamas's attacks on Israelis were spectacular in being so visible, the kinds of deaths now being visited upon Palestinians in Gaza, the destruction of entire high-rise buildings, entire blocks, entire neighborhoods with missiles and bombs, I think one need only think for a moment what high-powered missile does to a human body. Yeah. And I think, the language of barbarism should not be reserved for just the kinds of acts that Hamas committed, the crimes.
Not to mention the fact that the word barbarism and savagery have certainly, especially during the last couple of decades, post 9/11. When referring to people of the Middle East, particularly of Arab origin, carry a very strong weight of cultural racism to it as well.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed that out. This is language, the language of barbarism and savagery and of animals is language that dates really to the 19th century in fueling racism and ideas about race and racial difference, in ways that since the 19th century have made it easier for the powerful to kill the racialized. And indeed, this language is now only fueling Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian sentiment, and is language that should be discarded entirely. Yeah. People, as our guide calls for, whether it's in the context of U.S.-led wars or wars in Gaza that the U.S. is clearly implicated in, it's important to describe the acts committed. Similar to the language of terrorism. Terrorism has long been a virtually useless term. So to terrorist, because it's a term that just gets applied by anyone to any person or group or individual that they don't like, and thus makes it easier to target them for attack and death. And that, of course, is also the language that is circulating when it comes to Hamas's attacks that were clearly these are military attacks on civilians that should be condemned. But the language of terrorism is simply not useful and has not been useful for decades. Again, as our guide shows, there are numerous more accurate, more honest alternatives that we propose.
And that's one of the things that I really like about this guide is the fact that you not only identify these euphemisms, but you define them and you provide alternatives that can be practically used and employed, not just by casual consumers and activists, but by actual reporters and members of the media to employ so that we can better represent and understand what is really going on.
Precisely. So in the case of terrorism or terrorists, we can talk about militants rather than terrorists. In the case of terrorism, acts of mass violence, attacks on civilians, perhaps the phrase terror attacks. But again, one sees in the case of the war in Gaza, but the same was true in the U.S.-led wars after the attacks of 9/11, the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and far beyond. The acts of governments that so clearly terrorize people, the kind of fear that people in Gaza must currently be suffering, those who've been ordered by the Israeli military to leave their homes, 1.1 million people. How can one describe anything other than a kind of terrorizing?
Yeah.
So the problem often is that the language is used inconsistently, and our guide and the website you mentioned, wordsaboutwarmatter.org, calls on people to discard the most troubling and most euphemistic, most Orwellian language, and instead to adopt language that is more honest, more descriptive. It's not a radical shift we're asking for. We're just asking people to describe what is happening, especially what is happening to human beings in war.
And it goes even deeper than just a desire to avoid talking about death and destruction to some more fundamental concepts. I mean, if you think about it, and you allude to this, I think, in your guide, wordsaboutwarmatter.org, even the Department of Defense itself is, and its name, is a euphemism. It didn't used to be the Department of Defense. It used to be the War Department. And for most of the history of the United States. So many of the terms that you're talking about just go towards warping reality because if you repeat that Department of Defense, DOD, Department of Defense over and over again, you get to think in your head, well, yeah, okay, I guess this is for defense. It's not just for it's not about like going out and killing people around the world. Which it primarily is. It's about defending the homeland or whatever that concept happens to be. Even the concept of a homeland is I don't know if that's one on your list, but it certainly deserves to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, the Department of Homeland Security does indeed provide another painful and unhelpful example. But indeed, the language of defense is one of those examples that most bothers me and is most troubling.
It really should be the offense department, if you think about it.
Well, indeed, the track record shows that the agency that has been so named, that was more honestly named the Department of War, the War Department, has a long track record of launching offensive wars. Yeah. Calling it the Defense Department is a kind of PR. It is exactly what Orwell was warning about and writing about. And it goes beyond just the agency. It also goes to when members of the media